Welcome, listeners, to a realm where shadows dance and whispers echo. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and this is Quills and Chills, the podcast that brings you face to face with the masterminds behind the macabre. In each episode, we journey into the minds of horror writers and filmmakers to uncover the secrets lurking within their tales of terror. From classic tales to modern nightmares, we'll traverse the corridors of the human psyche and unravel the threads of dread that keep us turning the pages or sitting out there in the dark. Welcome to Quills and Chills. Hello and welcome back to Quills and Chills. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and today I am joined by Author-Allison-Gunn. Allison she's a researcher, she's a writer, she is a tarot reader, and that makes me a fan already. And I'm super excited to talk to her today about her debut novel, Nowhere. It's a chilling blend of gothic suspense and small town secrets. And you know what? I cannot wait to dive into this world that you have created. So welcome to the show, Allison.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So before we get started, I gave you a little warning about this up front. You know, first of all, I always like to sort of get to know you a little bit, but you had something in your bio that I understand everybody just gets very excited about, myself included. So we got to talk about this. We got to talk about your little precocious pup and this tabby, this cat of yours. What is up with this cat? Tell us all about the cat.
Yeah, it's hilarious that she's making the rounds. Oh, Connie was a pandemic kitty. And so we adopted her from an animal shelter in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia. And I thought from the moment that I met her, like, oh, this cat is wonderful. I absolutely am in love with her. She was kind of like an outcast at her animal shelter. They actually had her in like a special room separated from everyone else. It was called the Serenity Room. And I was like, oh, she's the outsider. She's being picked on. Literally, like while we were sitting in the room visiting her, there was a cat trying to get in through the door because it was kind of a free range thing. And the cat was very clearly trying to kick her ass. And we were like, what? Why does Connie have a target on her back? What's going on here? Well, I'm here to tell you we learned. Once we got her home, she hid under the bed for several days, but nevertheless, I thought, we're going to bond. This is going to be great. I've always been like a cat person, always been really close to pets. I worked in the veterinary field for years and years and years. So I was just convinced we were going to have like this tight bond because I saved her, right? From years of being in this place. No. She's maintained her aloofness. She bonded to one of my daughters and refuses to bond with anybody else. Quite frequently, wherever she is, she's causing problems. But it's also like, I'm not entirely sure that Connie realizes she's causing problems. You can never quite suss out whether she's being deliberately diabolical and causing problems or whether she like doesn't know where she's at, That's Connie's vibe, is it's just chaos.
6 of one, half does the other, right?
Exactly, right. Either way, I'm perceiving it as diabolical.
1,000%. I have a rule in my house, nothing bitchier than me, so I don't have a lot of cats around me, but I love dogs. I'm a big fan of dogs.
I was going to say, I don't know, Connie would not appreciate that rule. She's queen of the roost.
I love it. I did have a cat once that thought he was a dog, but he was also raised with 3 other dogs, so I think it was just kind of it was that nature versus nurture. I think that age-old argument. He learned to be a dog. We used to walk the cat on a leash. So tell us a little bit about you. So are you in West Virginia?
The internet connection is a little spotty, so I'm like trying to hear. You said tell you a little bit about me.
I know, I've been having
but I didn't hear the rest.
Morning long. Where are you from?
I'm from all over the place. So I was born, we were living in Bedford, Virginia at the time, which is actually partially where Dalmouth, the like integral town in Nowhere, is based. But technically born in Lynchburg, Virginia. And then we ended up moving constantly, thanks to my dad's profession as a pastor. And so we moved all around. There was lots of Appalachia in there. Then we went to the deep south, down into the lower half of Georgia, and then over to Alabama. Ended up moving back up into Pennsylvania in the Appalachian area. I've moved 25 times total. So whenever somebody asks me where I'm from, it's very difficult to say, other than like kind of East Coast, kind of asterisk. But I mean, I will say I was born in Appalachia, raised for a good chunk in Appalachia, and mercifully have returned to Appalachia in my adult years after what I would say is a horrific jail stint in DC as a government worker.
Oh my. Well, what was your journey into writing? How did you venture into becoming a writer?
So, I mean, that I've written from the time I was 4. I mean, truly, like it was something that always kind of motivated me. It was something that I wanted to be doing from a very, very young age. In fact, a couple of times I've been asked what my first like novel was or my first big story was. And at 4 years old, I wrote like this little mini series about Candy PI, which kind of sounds vaguely like, I don't know, like a Ty West movie or something, but I'm pretty sure she was just like searching for like the missing diamond or something, totally innocent. In any case, I mean, I kept that up all throughout my primary education, secondary, etc. I should have tried to publish much sooner than I did, but I just simply did not have the confidence to do so. But I always like to tell people like writing is my healthiest coping mechanism, my therapy. So it's always been there. It's always the place where I've been able to work out a lot of my own issues and things that I felt like I couldn't necessarily talk to anybody about. And Nowhere is definitely a product of that, for sure. It deals a lot with the main character's queerness. And that was something growing up as a pastor's kid in the fundamentalist portion of Christianity was definitely not anything I could talk about. And so that bled over and very much influenced Nowhere's core premise.
Well, let's talk about Nowhere, shall we? Because I got to tell you, this book, first of all, I got to tell you, you made me cry. And that is a first for this show. No one has made me cry, and I had moments where I was like, but then
quite the compliment.
Towards the end, and obviously we're not going to get into spoilers, but I have moments where I was like, oh my god. So I loved it. That, needless to say, I just could not put this thing down, and it is a page turner to the very, very end. I will say that, but I'm not going to gush. I'm not going to fanboy anymore. I want you to tell us what this book is about.
I mean, you can certainly continue to gush if you want. I'm eating that up for certain. I'm a debut author. I need you to like prop me up as much as you possibly can. But yeah, Nowhere really at its core. I mean, you're talking about crying. Probably because at its core, Nowhere is really a family drama that's sort of wrapped inside that horror thriller package. It takes place, like I was saying earlier, in this tiny Appalachian town in Southern Virginia called Dalmouth, fictional, based off of the Bedford area where I was born. But it truly is focused on the Kennan family. Follows them. They just underwent this terrible loss. A year later, Rachel, who is the mother of the family, she's basically one of 2 main characters that we have in the story. And she's also the police chief of this town, though they just relocated there. She's not from there. She's very much an outsider. She happens to find a body in the woods, which kicks off an investigation. However, simultaneous to that, children begin disappearing into the woods. So her attention is kind of divided in 2 different sections. She's chasing after what are essentially ghosts in the woods, right? Like missing children, disappearing, something calling to them. Rachel's not one to necessarily buy in to all of that. So she's still looking at it from a very rational perspective. Meanwhile, the family, the rest of her family, which is Fenn and her 2 surviving daughters, they are very much still dealing with grief at home. Very quickly, everyone catches on that this threat is far larger and more imminent than they realized. So it threatens to destroy not just them as a family, not just them as individuals, but perhaps even the entire town. So it becomes very much a race against time.
Well, let's talk about the family a little bit. The Keenan family. There's Rachel, Finn, Charlie, Lucy, and of course Aiden. And all of these characters are very central to the narrative. So that like I feel like I knew these people. I knew these characters, and I would love to know sort of how did you come to sort of put this story together? I don't know if I'm asking the question the right way. I know what I want to say, but I'm trying to be careful about spoilers. So, how did you sort of? What was the inspiration for the story? How did you get to developing these characters? I'm sorry, I want to say more, but
Yeah.
there's stuff that I don't know if I should say yet. So, if you want to say it, you can say it,
Yeah, it's hard because with
especially about
Nowhere,
Aiden.
there's so much I feel like that could be given away unintentionally. You know what I mean? When you're talking about just the basic plot. So I myself am going to have to monitor for potential spoilers. I'll do my best. But in terms of the characters and how they were inspired and developed, I have been talking a lot lately with both fans of the book, which is flattering, and also folks that are interviewing me or just curious. There is a lot of myself in each and every single one of these characters. So I didn't find it particularly difficult to develop them as human beings. I kind of been shocked by some people's very strong reaction to especially Rachel and Fenn being difficult human beings. In part because I find that in a lot of people. It to me is representative of so many people dealing with grief. There is absolute profound grief throughout this entire book, and it really is a novel that's focused on how these four individuals, the Kennans, are dealing with such a horrific, painful loss very early on. And in fact, I think it's even part of a lot of the summaries. Their son, Aiden, dies in a car crash with Fenn behind the wheel. Fenn is unfortunately an alcoholic. He's struggling with that as well as other aspects of his mental health. But yeah, for me, I see myself in each and every one of the characters and really felt like I connected to them. More sort of whimsical, if you will, I guess is a good way of calling it. I really felt like these characters just started speaking for themselves. And I know that's an unsatisfactory answer. People want to know, like, how
Oh,
do
that's
you
great.
further develop a character? How do you construct a character that's believable, etc.? But they just started talking in my head, at the risk of sounding a little, a little problematic. They just started talking. They were just there, and yeah, you start like filling in the gaps as time goes on and you're refining and editing. But for the most part, their core characters were just there and fleshed out and very real from the start.
I understand that being a writer myself. I have characters. Sometimes you get very strong presence in your brain about who this character is. Like you said, their voice just starts talking to you, and they really start sort of coming to life, and then coming to life on the page. I gotta say, I was really kind of shocked at just how easily I was consumed by all of their personal struggles and really connected. It's funny that you say that there's so much of you in each of them, because I really felt like I connected on a certain level with each of them as well. Not just Rachel and Finn, but also Charlie and Lucy. And there were little moments where I was like, oh, okay. I certainly have sort of felt that before in my life. I can understand this feeling. But I don't know if it's dysfunction. I guess dysfunction is probably a great way to describe it. But there's an intensity between Rachel and Finn that comes from the accident with Aiden that is just, it's so compelling, and it just drew me in, and I loved it. I guess my question is, can you talk a little bit about putting together sort of these really heavy emotional themes, and on top of that, building this story that is so incredibly suspenseful and moving, and I'm going to say unforgiving in a way, just because it just did not stop. It would not let me put it down. And so like I said, I loved it. I thought it was great. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of weaving all of that together.
Yeah. Well, so you were talking about the intensity of the relationship between Fenn and Rachel. And I'll be perfectly honest and say that came from a particularly toxic relationship that I had. I talk about it in the author's notes. It's fine. I'm fine talking about it now. But the very beginning of Nowhere, began after a particularly nasty conflict between a former partner and I that almost turned violent. And the next thing I knew, I was on the train in DC commuting to my job and whipped out my phone and started writing this incredible story that had just been kind of like downloading into my head for weeks beforehand. And then that was the thing that just sparked it off. And so those dynamics that are so toxic and painful and real and raw, those are coming from a very honest place, very difficult experiences that I personally went through. Not to say like it's an exact copy of that, because what writer in their sane mind would actually like word for word put that onto the page. But definitely based off of my own experiences, for sure. And in a way, I'm glad that that comes through on the page, because I mean, if it didn't, then I don't know. It feels a little bit like, what was it all for? This is like, Nowhere is the product of a very, very dark period in my life. And if I had to go through that in order to bring Nowhere into the world, it was worth it, for me anyways. The relationships between Finn and Rachel with their daughters, I, oddly enough, I have two daughters. They're twins. So not necessarily the same ages as Charlie and Lucy, but one of them is named Karis. And in my head, even back then, I was thinking, oh, there are some similarities there, even though she was much, much younger than Charlie at the time. Didn't think about the fact that it was a C and a C. And then Lucy, I have a Lennon. And she was the age that Lucy was at the time, maybe a little bit older than what Lucy is. Now they're almost teenagers. And you can definitely see, weirdly enough, those characteristics in those particular two characters, those two daughters, Charlie and Lucy, are very similar to the ways that my daughters interact with the world and the way that they see the world and interact with me. So, I mean, for those particular two characters, again, that was very much a translation from real life and the grief that we were experiencing as part of this very negative relationship that was happening at the time, the grief over we'd been separated from our family just by virtue of having to get jobs and moving away, etc. That ended up landing us in a place that we felt very uncomfortable, kind of in a precarious situation. We felt very much like outsiders. So that translated to the page very well. But I'll also say, again, growing up as a pastor's kid, we just moved constantly from town to town to town. And despite the fact that, we were welcomed to those places, we were asked to come to those places and kind of put on this bizarre pedestal, simultaneously, we were always outsiders because we weren't from there, right? We were asked to come, but we weren't really from there. And then we were put under a microscope. And that is doubly true for the fundamentalist Christian community. You, as a pastor's kid, pastor's family, really, are held to standards that nobody else is held to. Even recently, I've gotten messages from my dad's former parishioners talking about how I wasn't the person they thought that I was. And it's like, well, I was 16 when you knew me, of course, at 37, I have changed now. So that should demonstrate a little bit of like how unrealistic the views that these people form about the outsider, right? The person that's been brought into the community to serve as a representative of something. And that's precisely what the Kennons are, because of Rachel being the police chief that's new to the town and brought in almost as what I've described before as a DEI hire by the county, so to speak. So she's welcome there and simultaneously not. And the same goes for her family. That's compounded by the fact that it comes out not of her volition, but of courtesy of the internet, that she's queer. And she's been closeted for quite a while. That's a persistent source of conflict between her and Finn. And once that comes out, it's not game over entirely, but it very much alters the trajectory of the family and their perception within that community. because that's a deviation that is just simply unacceptable to this town, or I should say most of the residents of the town. It doesn't have the cosmic influence or ramifications that it did in my mind, where I was staying up all kinds of hours praying. It's really quite sad now that I look back on it, because I imagine my daughters in that position losing sleep over their identity is a horrific thing. But that was what I went through. I don't think Rachel ever felt that way, but I think her family did. I think, Charlie in particular, who is also coming into her own and realizing that she has feelings that she wasn't expecting, that she's different from the rest of Dalmouth. I think there's a shame that they take on for Rachel, which is particularly tragic. So yes, all of that is to say, I definitely feel like that battle with being the fear of being ostracized, desperately trying to fit into a particular image, desperately trying to run away from reality, that came through in Nowhere very strongly. And it is truly the worst nightmare of being completely viewed as an outsider and a threat,
I want to talk a little bit about the Appalachian folklore and the occult. And I was wondering if you, without spoilers, talk a little bit about the inspiration for the big bad, the phenomenon that's happening in the story.
Yeah. See, this is what I'm talking about when I say it's hard to talk about Nowhere without putting in some of the spoilers, because everybody is very interested in the folkloric aspect. But in order to talk about the folkloric aspect, it's like I got to dance around all these spoilers for folks who haven't had an opportunity to actually read the book yet. But one of the things that has always interested me is mysteries surrounding disappearing persons, not just like necessarily true crime, but mass disappearances where there's basically no explanation for what could have happened. So, for instance, from the time I was a very, very young child, my mom was totally obsessed with the lost colony of Roanoke, which happened in the 1600s. If, for those of you who don't know what that is, basically it was a colony of over 100 English settlers who came to Roanoke Island, which is just off the coast of modern day North Carolina. And over the course of, I believe it was 1 or 2 years, they ended up disappearing entirely. And historians are still not entirely sure where they went. There are all kinds of different theories, ranging from there was a massive hurricane that washed them away to they moved inland and became part of the Croatoa people, which there are some hints dropped in Nowhere as to the story of the lost colony of Roanoke. But so that kind of thing, those legends that are almost uniquely American in that sense, those definitely made their way into Nowhere because they were influences right from the time I was a wee, tiny little kid. But I've always had an affection for folklore just in general, whether that was Grimm's fairy tales, whether it was legends carried over from Native American populations. I didn't realize when I was growing up in Appalachia that some of the things that terrified me the most were actually part of Appalachian folklore until I was an adult and I was going through undergraduate studies and then later graduate studies and then returning to Appalachia and really just becoming totally obsessed with Appalachian folklore at that point. And it was at that point I started going through all of these little terrors I had when I was a child and going, oh, that's a story that was handed down from this place and that place. And, not to say that they're not real. I don't want to spoil the glory and spooks of Appalachia for anyone. But truly, if you look at the history of Appalachian folklore, you can see where settlers from all over Europe brought those stories over into Appalachia, especially those settlers who were going into the mines because they had nowhere else to go. You can see where they brought those stories over and then tweaked them just slightly to fit into this region and become a part of sort of the overarching narrative. Now, modern day America finds it very difficult to parse out what those stories are, what they came from. Are they real? Are they not real? And to me, it doesn't matter the real versus real part for what it's worth. I'm fascinated by kind of tracking where those stories came from. And so when we're talking about Appalachian folklore, it's not just purely isolated unto itself. It's this fusion of folklore that comes from a lot of European influences, but also, again, you have indigenous peoples' legends that are incorporated and meshed into it. And then there is an element of Americana that finds its way in there as well. So it's just a melting pot of stories, which is why I think it resonates so strongly with people right now, especially on social media. They seem to be very eager to learn more about Appalachian folklore at this point. But yeah, it's threaded all throughout nowhere. There's one portion where you have one of the deputies talking about, you know, haints and goblins and all these kinds of stuff that even he, as an Appalachian native, is like, that's nonsense. That's absolute garbage. Okay, but is it? You know what I mean? Where did those stories come from? Those are embedded into, you know, Appalachian life. I mean, they truly are. We end up painting a lot of the undersides of our porches with something called haint blue to keep the spirits away. I personally have, you know, railroad spikes nailed in at the corners of my property to protect it. These are things that still very much live and breathe as traditions in Appalachia, but their roots are far, far, far back, and they shine through in Nowhere. So I think that people, when they start to read Nowhere, there may be things that they can point to, such as like haints, goblins, boogers, stuff like that, that they're like, I've heard that from Appalachia. Like, I've heard that listening to TikTok stories about Appalachia. But there are also things that I think people are going to read and go, wait, do I know that story from Celtic folklore? Do I know that story from Eastern European folklore? And the answer is yes, because that all came through and into Appalachia. So it's there.
So now you flipped a switch in my brain. So I'm curious, when there's a two-parter question. I think it's Jeremy's story about his grandmother, what his grandmother told him about the woods. Is that, I feel like that is a blend of some things that I've heard just growing up, you know, in North Carolina. But is that from Appalachian folklore, number one? And number two, did you have like a flow chart or something where you're figuring out, oh, I'm going to weave all of these things into this story and do it that way? That's the switch that you flipped in my brain. I'm like, how did you plot all this out?
Yeah, so the answer to number one is yes, that is definitely Appalachian folklore as it exists now, right? Like I said, it's embedded throughout multiple different cultures. But yes, that was borrowed directly from the stories that are still passed around today in Appalachia. The answer to question two is a little complicated because, as you know, the writing process is iterative. So when I began writing Nowhere, it was truly first draft, just put it out on the page, whatever lands there. And of course, there was plenty of folklore there, but I am not a traditional plotter. I'm somewhere in between that, like, constant question whether you're a plotter or a pantser, so to speak. Are you flying by the seat of your pants or are you plotting it all out? I'm somewhere in between. And definitely with the first draft of Nowhere, there wasn't even an outline. It was truly just me pouring my heart out onto the page. Oftentimes, again, on the notes app on my cell phone at the time while I was commuting. And so I didn't really think about what are the aspects of, you know, Appalachian folklore that are going to make it in there. What are the aspects of, you know, just purely European legends, folklore, all of that stuff. I didn't think about it. It wasn't until after I started working with Lone Lee, who's my editor at Atria, and my agent, Logan Harper, who's with Jane Retrosin, that I started to have to answer those kinds of questions because they're not from Appalachia. So they're looking at it with complete fresh eyes and going, wait, can you explain that one a little more? Can you flesh that out for me? Or even, you know, we wanted a little spookier. What is there something you can add in there? And I'd read the page and go, oh, well, that's because you don't understand how haints work. You don't understand what you got to do to keep the spirits away in the night, so to speak. And so at that point, I had become well versed enough in Appalachian folklore to be able to pick out these areas and go like, I can expand here on what this means. So the conversation about Jeremy's grandmother was always in there. Again, for readers who haven't been able to pick up the book yet, Jeremy is is Rachel's deputy in the town, and he is from the area. So he's able to point to, here's what my grandmother thought back in the day, but that's nonsense. That scene was always in existence. However, the elaboration into specifically what was sort of like mountain belief, he calls it like hillbilly nonsense, is what he says. That wasn't explained as in depth as it is now in the current draft. Well, the final book, I guess.
Yes. All right. This question, I think you've just kind of answered it for me, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So I thought this book was absolutely unrelenting all the way up to the very last line. You just did not let me off the hook. You did not let me out of it easy. I got to tell you. Did you always know from the outset where you were going to end up at the end?
I did. Yes. Yeah. That's the funny thing. I just got done saying that I'm somewhere in between being a planner and a pantser. I guess like we would call it
you can have those moments, right? You know where you want to go. You just don't always know what the path you're going to get there.
So. Yeah. So actually at one point I was going to film school way long ago. And I think that's kind of where the idea of like hitting particular beats, but on a high level came from. Because I can see, quote unquote, these scenes in my head, and I know what beats I need to hit. It's that everything else that's in between. So the beginning and the end of Nowhere were in my head from the very beginning. That there was no question what was going to happen at the end, which, as you said, is pretty, it's unrelenting, if you will. That was there straight away. The only thing that was added to the end was the prologue. And that is a direct result of my agent going, I think we need to add just a little kind of hint that maybe the door is not completely closed on the story. Not for the sake of a sequel, but for the sake of not leaving a reader going, damn, that was heavy.
What the hell happened? What? Like, yeah. But I honestly could have taken it either way. So I love the prologue at the end, but I also, again, just kind of loved where you ended up with everyone. It was great. So like I said, it was just
a lot of times people want happy endings, even in horror. Sometimes, a lot of times, actually. I mean, I'm sure you're aware that a lot of times the endings of horror movies and even some horror books are changed for American audiences to make it a little lighter. So I'm actually really pleased, Rick, to hear that you're like, yeah, no, go for it.
I remember thinking, going through this, it took me a couple days to read. So, as I'm putting it down, I'm like, well, I need to kind of know what it's hard to put down, because I'm like, I need to know, how do you get out of this? Like, have you just, you've ended up now, how do you turn this around? Like, where do you go with this? And I was kind of I really loved where you ended up, because I didn't want it to be any other way, because I felt like it would have been cheating. And so I thought it was just really great. So, and again, I'm going to stop talking because I'll probably.
I know. Again, it's hard not to give the spoilers, but yeah.
All right. Last question for you, without giving anything away. We've been spoiler conscious the entire time here. Do you have a favorite moment or a favorite scene that you are most excited for readers to experience? And before you answer that, I have several of my own, but there's really one, and I think it was the absolute, well, I know it was, but I'm trying to describe the feeling. It was that absolute sinking feeling I had when Charlie was with her friends in the woods, and sort of what happened from that moment. And I just remember feeling gutted, and I'm like, oh, this girl's got it. So that was probably one of my favorite moments.
Yeah.
Oh, and the fact that Lucy knew every fucking thing. That
I know. Nobody listens to the kids, do they? And we should. They are wiser than we realize. But yeah, she knows the whole thing. That is one of the tragic things, I think, with Lucy, is she's such a sweetie, right? She's the sort of lightness in the Kennan family. And yet this whole time she's going, this is what's going on. This is what, listen to me. This is what's going on. Somebody pay attention. And nobody listens to her because of her age. And I think that's the only reason they don't listen to her. It's not that she's untrustworthy or anything like that. It's just, she's a little kid. But no, in answer to your question, again, it's hard to do without giving spoilers. But I think each and every single character has a moment where I'm like, I can't wait for people to see that aspect of them, that moment for them. You know, in particular, I'm thinking of Jeremy's last scene. For him, I think is very poignant because it shows the depth of his character that hadn't really been revealed up until that point. He's sort of a good old boy for the most part, or a bro, if you will, a redneck bro with a gun, which is terrifying. But in the end, you find out like he's not what he seems. He's got a lot more depth than what he was giving on. And so, you know, I that aspect, I'm excited for people to learn about him more, because I think he's a character that's easy to dismiss as just like background character. However, when I'm thinking about Rachel and Fenn and Charlie and Lucy, I mean, my goodness, it's very difficult for me to choose between scenes. However, I feel like, and this will not be a popular answer, I am certain it's not going to be a popular answer. I would say one of the scenes that I was most pumped to write, and that like just so vividly lived in my brain, is there's a very intense confrontation between Rachel and Fenn about midway through the book, as all of this like very bizarre phenomena is happening, but like around them, and they're so consumed by, you know, their animosity for one another, that they're missing a lot of what's happening that any of us on the outside would be looking at and going, guys, can you like can you pause for a minute? Yeah, take a good look around. Things are not okay. And that scene just like popped in my head. It just lived and breathed, and I could feel it. And I'm just very excited for people to read that, and a little nervous too, because I know for some people that scene's going to be really difficult. It is not the prettiest version of Fenn or Rachel, and I'm actually excited for the conversations that it might generate. But I understand it could be difficult for some people to get through.
So I know exactly what the scene you're talking about. I'm sure I do anyway. And it was part of that intensity, that unrelenting intensity that this story had. And it's also going back to what I was saying earlier about how I just got consumed with what was going on with them. I feel like I would trust the readers will as well. They know where that's coming from. And so they're just as invested, because I was super invested. And I was like, this needs to happen. I'm like, this needs to happen. And you did not disappoint in that regard. I know exactly the scene, and it was fantastic. I was just literally could not get any closer to that page. So
there had to be a boiling point. Otherwise, like you were saying with the ending, like it would not be realistic to paint these characters in just a rosy light. I don't believe in doing that as an author. I don't think that's an accurate representation of humanity. And even as a horror writer, where you do suspend some belief, I think it's very important to convey sort of the human condition without making it sanitized. I can't do that for my characters, no matter how much people may want to escape with the book. I won't do that disservice by making these people out to be heroes constantly. They are anti-heroes for sure. And so that conflict was essential to happen. Like I said, I understand there's going to be some difficult conversations around it, but I'm excited for people to read it and what will be explored as a result of that.
Well, it was
spoiler free.
So the biggest question I have for you, because I am now probably your biggest fan, and I want to know what's next. What are you working on that you could tell us about?
Yeah, so I'm somebody who, I mean, I have probably 7 novels in my virtual drawer. There's never a time when I'm not writing, whether that is, jotting down some crappy poetry like in my journal on the side, or whether that's working on my next manuscript, short story, etc. But right now I am working on a manuscript that is a really interesting blend of worlds. I don't want to give too much away about it because it's still something that we're discussing with my editor and the rest of the team. But it blends, believe it or not, Hollywood with Appalachia. And
Wow.
there is, I would
Now
say,
you're
an
talking
element.
right up my alley.
Yeah, definitely still got that thriller thread that Nowhere has. There's definitely investigative quality to it, but it very much hones in on the idea that we think we know people by viewing them through a screen. It speaks to the whole influencer phenomena, the way that all of our media is starting to shift to not the superstars, right? Not the people who used to sort of dominate our conversations, but more so everyday people being online, having a presence, and you start to feel like you know this person. I'm certain there are folks who probably have listened to your podcast from the beginning and they're like, yeah, I'm aware of Rick. I've even had those moments listening to podcasters and whatnot, because you feel like you're coming into my home. You're just an average Joe like me, and I know you. When the reality is that we don't know what people are doing behind the scenes. You don't know these influencers. You don't know who they really are at all, other than the persona that they present. So I'm excited. I was actually working on it right before I got on the call. So
Well, I
it's
love it.
fresh
I'm
in my
super
mind.
excited for it.
Yeah.
So I wait with bated breath. So.
Awesome.
So the book is Nowhere, and it's everywhere on March 20. I swear to God, I did not. That just came to me out of the blue. I did
That was
not plan
beautiful, Rick.
I swear it just popped in my head. So, but
I'm gonna
anyway,
steal that one.
it's available March 25th, and as we always like to say here, please support your local bookstores whenever possible. So,
100%.
Allison, how can our audience find you online or on social?
Yeah, so the most traditional route is www.authorallisongunn.com. But elsewhere, you can find me in too many places. So I'm on Bluesky, I'm on the artist formerly known as Twitter, I am on Facebook as well as Instagram, etc. All of it is Author Allison Gunn, so you should be able to find me pretty easily. And I always like to tell people, I used to be terrified to reach out to authors that I was a fan of or that I wanted to learn from. Please, if you see me at an event or you have a burning question, shoot me a message, and if I'm able to answer it, if I have time to answer it, I absolutely will. I don't love the idea of people excluding having conversations with their fans. I think that's some pretentious BS that we should probably shy away from now. So yes, please find me online and I'll give you a shout out. Happy to talk.
Awesome. I'll put all of that in the show notes. It'll be up on screen for the video version as well. So, Allison, little dropouts aside, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I certainly do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on. This was wonderful.
All right, you guys, we'll see you next time on Quills and Chills.
Bye.
Thanks for joining me on another episode of Quills and Chills. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the mysterious and the haunted. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to support us by subscribing on your preferred podcast platform and leaving us a rating or review, because your feedback helps keep those chills running down both our spines. And feel free to share the show with your favorite fellow horror enthusiasts. Also, if you guys have any spooky stories, strange encounters, or paranormal experiences of your own, I'd love to hear them. Reach out to me on social media or email me at quillsandchillspodcast@gmail.com. Who knows? Your story might end up on a very special episode. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I will see you back here next time on Quills and Chills. Bye, y'all.